When it comes to processing high-performing children, the world's educational systems split on exactly how to identify and cultivate intellectual output. One approach rests on the assumption that intellectual capability is an innate biological trait. In this view, high ability is something a child is born with, waiting to be diagnosed. The opposing philosophy assumes that cognitive ceilings are flexible. Here, top-tier performance is entirely the product of environmental conditioning, targeted resources, and continuous practice. These psychological definitions of human potential dictate multi-billion-dollar policy decisions, determining where nations choose to direct their educational resources. We can map these international policies on a two-axis grid. The horizontal axis measures a state's belief in intelligence, ranging from strictly innate to entirely acquired. The vertical axis measures educational provision, tracking from segregated to egalitarian. Applying this framework reveals clusters. The US and UK map to one side, while Japan, China, and Scandinavia group into entirely different operational quadrants. Categorizing these policies provides a structural baseline, but to measure their actual efficacy, we have to look at how these rigid systemic variables collide with the cultural realities on the ground. To isolate the effect of environmental conditioning, we look to Communist Hungary in 1969. Laszlo Polgar, an educational psychologist, initiated a highly controlled, localized experiment. Polgar operated on a strict public axiom regarding human capability. He published a book titled Bring Up Genius and maintained that, quote, geniuses are made, not born. He tested this hypothesis on his own 3 daughters, removing them from standard schooling to subject them to up to 10 hours of targeted daily practice in a single domain, chess. The conditioning yielded precise results. Despite having no proven biological predisposition for the game, all 3 siblings attained world-class competitive rankings. Judith, the youngest, eventually achieved a global rank of 13th, becoming the highest-rated female chess player in the history of the sport. The Polgar experiment isolates the extreme end of the acquired spectrum. It proves that relentless, highly targeted environmental conditioning can produce elite outcomes, providing a comparative baseline for how state-run models allocate their resources. The United States operates on the opposite psychological assumption. The U.S. model dictates that high cognitive ability is innate, largely fixed by early childhood, and requires early identification. The system relies heavily on formal diagnostics. Schools deploy standardized test batteries and aggregate teacher recommendations to continuously scan the student body for high aptitude. Once identified, these students are filtered out of the general population and placed into advanced placement courses, summer academies, and separate educational tracks. This sorting process is highly stratified. The system explicitly ranks bright children into formal categories ranging from moderately to profoundly gifted, assigning resources based on those specific diagnostic tiers. This domestic segregation connects directly to international geopolitics. The volume of engineers and scientists graduating in China and India creates direct pressure on the U.S. to maximize the yield of its own top percentile. This pressure materialized at the federal level in 2006, when President George W. Bush announced the American Competitiveness Initiative, an aggressive policy aimed at training 70,000 high school teachers, explicitly to instruct these selected high-performing cohorts. The U.S. model relies entirely on extraction. It assumes that physically separating and aggressively resourcing top-tier students is a structural requirement for maintaining a national technological advantage. The United Kingdom presents a hybrid case, one where the biological assumption of innate intelligence collides with deep socio-political friction. While the UK system broadly accepts that measurable innate talent exists, it contends with a strong egalitarian political culture that objects to giving extra resources to those already succeeding. This ideological divide often plays out among the instructional staff.
Many teachers actively oppose creating separate tracks for top performers, arguing instead that any surplus funding should be directed entirely to struggling students. In 2002, the UK government attempted a structural compromise. They established the National Academy for Gifted and Talented Youth, which allowed schools to voluntarily nominate top students for masterclasses without breaking the state ban on formal academic selection. The policy failed to achieve scale. Because participation was voluntary, ideological resistance at the local level blocked implementation. Historically, 3 out of every 10 secondary schools refuse to nominate a single child for the program. This data exposes a vulnerability in hybrid models. When a state relies on local educators to implement differentiated programs they fundamentally oppose, ideological friction renders the policy highly inefficient. In Scandinavia, this egalitarian ideology operates without compromise. Rooted in cultural mandates of modesty and social solidarity, the system explicitly rejects the concept of treating high-aptitude children differently. Japan achieves a similar structural uniformity, but derives it from a different assumption. The Japanese model assumes all children are born with identical innate potential. Consequently, the public system enforces absolute parity. All students cover the exact same syllabus at the exact same pace for the entire duration of their compulsory schooling. When students process the material faster than the baseline, they are not extracted into advanced tracks. Instead, the system loops them back into the classroom infrastructure, expecting them to act as peer educators for their classmates. China offers a variation on this non-diagnostic approach through a strict self-selection model for advanced instruction. The Chinese system provides heavy supplementary education that restricts access based purely on individual motivation rather than pre-assessed diagnostic scores. State-run children's palaces in major cities offer extensive after-school academic programs. Any student can enroll. The only mandatory requirement is a flawless attendance record. Egalitarian and self-selection models prioritize collective social cohesion over individual maximization. Advanced students in these systems are structurally forced to either match the median pacing of their peers or independently self-fund their own acceleration. When we overlay the actual academic output of these nations onto our analytical framework, a complex picture emerges. This chart shows a flat statistical distribution. Macro-level data fails to identify a definitively superior model. Countries at opposite philosophical spectrums routinely produce similar top-tier results. This ambiguity occurs because state policies don't exist in a vacuum. Performance is heavily distorted by local variables outside the public school framework. In the UK, for instance, the public system is nominally non-selective, but middle-class families frequently migrate to specific zip codes to access better schools, creating selection through real estate rather than testing. In Japan, the cultural pressure for advancement overrides the uniform public syllabus. Ambitious demographics circumvent the slow pace of state schools by heavily utilizing a massive shadow sector of private out-of-school tuition. The data does confirm that non-selective systems, like those in Finland and Japan, can thrive and generate high-performing students without utilizing formal gifted tracks. However, these systems rely on highly specific conditions to function properly. They depend on remarkably competent, specialized instructional forces and largely homogeneous demographic populations that reduce variance in the classroom. Simply deleting selection parameters from a school district does not guarantee high performance. Educational policy cannot be copy-pasted across borders. It only succeeds when the framework locks tightly into the unique cultural and demographic realities of the population it serves. This video is brought to you by the IELTS FOCUS 0847-705-973, an English center specializing in comprehensive IELTS preparation.